ago, back on the coast of New England, I once worked on a whaling ship, as my father did and his father before him. I still remember the first time I saw a great whale. I was a young man working as a deckhand. Our vessel was under full sail when we came hard upon a pod of whales off starboard. Well, sir, a geyser came up and spewed a tail that must have been, 20 feet across, and it broke the surface. A moment later, the glistening body came fully into view, and another moment it was gone. In the years that followed, I saw, perhaps thousands of whales, 100 of them dead, killed by our harpoons, killed for their blubber, which was made into lamp oil, and their bone, which became stays for umbrellas and corsets. All along, though, I was awed by the grace, the beauty, and the power of these creatures. Somehow, I always felt that killing them was wrong. And one day, I just walked away from that whaling ship, and I never returned. I came here to Point Charles to work as a fisherman, but never again to hunt whales. I still see whales, though, as they come in close to shore. During the migration from the cold waters of the Arctic to the warm waters of Mexico and then back again. You know, folks around here just love the whales. They feel a special closeness to them. Especially this one man I know. Will Brannon is his name. Now, let me tell you a story about him. Will never came to the big city unless he had to. This day was special. He'd come to meet his young nephew he'd never seen before. Andy Delmont was coming to spend summer vacation. A bit nervous about the first meeting, Will had rushed to the airport so as to be on time. Will did most of the talking as the old truck bumped its way along. No one, no sir, no one, ever spent more than a few minutes with Will that he wasn't talking about whales. Not only did he talk about them, he carved them out of wood. He made his living as a sculptor. Not much of a living, but enough to get by.
Of the Bering Sea. The hunt begins every year about this time, and as before, the whaling fleet is expected to take many whales. The fleet is fast and is aided by helicopters and the very latest in underwater detection gear, enabling them to locate and kill many whales.
Andy didn't say anything, but that's when he first began to wonder about his uncle. He'd seen his reaction to the radio broadcast, saw the hurt in his eyes.
Well, Andy, it's not what you used to, but it's home for a while. Welcome to Point Charles. Throw your things in the bunk over there. And change your clothes. Get out of that suit and we can go into town.
What is all this stuff, Uncle Will?
It's all part of what I do. What I am. I love the sea. And I love all the creatures of the sea. Especially the whale. That's God's most magnificent creation.
Whales? What's the big deal about whales?
Andy, I can't tell you in so many words, but I can show you. Before you go back to school this fall, I hope you'll understand how I feel. Tomorrow we'll go down the harbor. Get to meet some friends of mine, Frank and Skip. Skip's about your age, maybe a little bit older. They run a fishing vessel.
The early morning hours on the North Coast, crisp and cool all year round. Sunlight finds its way through the trees to a stump heavy with moisture. The Point Charles Harbor, the home port of many fishing boats. Each day of the fishing season, the wind and waves permitting, the boats would go out for their daily catch. Sometimes the boats would stay out for days before returning to port with a boatload of fresh salmon to be sold. That's what most folks did for a living, including Frank and Skip.
Hi, Frank. I want you to meet someone. Andy, my sister's kid. He's visiting for the summer.
Nice to meet you, Andy. Heard a lot about you. This is my son, Skip.
Hi, Andy.
Well, I'll have some fun together this summer, eh? Come on aboard, I'll show you around.
Skip and Andy hit it off right away. Later that night, Will got a surprise phone call from Frank. It was good news. What Will had been waiting for. What Will knew would happen.
Yeah? You're kidding. Of course we would, yes! Goodbye, Frank! Andy! It's happened. I knew it would. I knew it!
What's wrong, Uncle Will?
There's nothing wrong. It's all right. We're going to find Gigi.
All right.
That call from Frank to Will was, of all things, an invitation to go on a scientific trip. Part of the venture would be an attempt to find Gigi. You see, Frank got a call from a boat skipper friend of his. He needed a navigator, as this scientist was doing some research on whales and had chartered his boat. He needed a couple of more hands, so Frank suggested Will and Andy. Will had done a lot of sailing, and Andy could help out. They were aboard the sailing vessel Miss Debs II out of Los Angeles. They were headed in a southwesterly direction. Right away, young Andy had second thoughts about being aboard. Was he seasick for a while? Looking up at the billowing sails didn't help a bit. Looking down at the water only made it worse. But time and soda crackers brought him around. Will had been seasick his first time out years ago, so he and Andy had a good laugh. You don't just sit around on a sailboat. There's always work to do. And the newly assembled crew soon got to know each other.
Script. We're hoping to come across Gigi and positively identify her. Since her release a number of years ago, there have been many reported sightings of Gigi, but we've never had positive proof that it was her.
If you come across a whale you think is Gigi, how will you know for certain that it's her?
Well, it's true that all California gray whales look pretty much alike, but Gigi has special markings put there when she was in the research tank. And in addition to those marks, chances are pretty good that there'll be other markings left there from a shield we placed over the radio transmitter we put on her back. We'll know it's Gigi, all right, if we find her.
How will you find Gigi, Dr. Carson?
Well, that's a good question. Quite honestly, because there's so many gray whales traveling along this coast, and the coastal area is so large, if we do find her, it'll be a very lucky find. From a scientific standpoint, though, we can track whales on sonar. It's a way of seeing underwater, or the hydrophone, which is a way of hearing underwater. And of course, if they break surface and spout, we can see them.
No one could say how long they'd be out. Dr. Carson had already been searching for a month. Andy was now fascinated with the ocean and spent a lot of time looking for the telltale sign of whales, a vapor spout. Will spent a lot of time explaining the wind and wave action. Will said a sailor always had to be on guard against the unexpected. Sunsets were always beautiful, but somehow at sea they always looked a little more beautiful. To Will, this sunset looked special. He was thinking Frank's phone call was quite a coincidence, or was it? His thoughts that hour turned to Gigi. He remembered the day the scientists and researchers wrapped up their study of Gigi. Her first move toward the ocean and freedom had begun. She was so large and heavy that a special sling and crane was used. Those who worked with her each day must have been sad at her departure. She was handled with great care. What did she feel? Could she feel? Unanswerable questions for scientists. Gigi looked in a way as if she was smiling. She was going home. Will was there when they put Gigi on a barge and took her to sea. They lowered the sling, and with powerful fluke strokes, she was gone. The moonlight skidded across the waves as Miss Debs, too, sailed on. Down below, Frank and Will closely examined coastal charts, listing areas the gray whales were known to travel. Dr. Carson and his divers had come across many whales during the search. There was no way of checking them all, and the California grays were known to be very shy. Folks living around here always found it hard to decide which was prettier, the mornings or the evenings. Foggy days were different from sunny days, of course, but just as pretty. Uncle Will got out of bed early that day. He fixed some breakfast and called Frank on the telephone to let him know he and Andy would be down to the boat shortly. Will and Frank also discussed the boys going on a canoe trip later in the day. Will would borrow another friend's truck and canoe for the trip to the river. Andy had never before been in a canoe, but with some instruction and help from Skip, he handled the paddle like an old-timer. The river extended inland about 12 miles, winding through forests and valleys, unspoiled by man and his careless ways of handling things of nature. Because the river joined the ocean, it was not unusual to find small sea animals that spent most of their time on the rocks of the coast, working their way up the river. The two boys continued paddling and looking. A sea otter playing with a rock, having an obvious carefree time. A moment later, a few feet away, a harbor seal popped its little round head out of the water. Skip and Andy tried to move closer, but the seal wanted no part of the boys. Then it dipped below the surface and disappeared. The boys paddled smoothly, having set a rhythm. Andy's mind was pleasantly wandering when there it was, the haunted cabin Skip mentioned. Some scary stories were told about it. Many times at night, folks say, they'd see weird lights and ghostly figures, sometimes in the cabin, other times on the water. The canoe passed the cabin with neither boy looking back, both determined to head home before darkness fell. The next morning, table talk was of Skip and the canoe trip. Andy had told Will about the haunted cabin and how they made it past the place just before dark. Andy asked his uncle if he thought the ghost stories told about the cabin were true. Will allowed he'd been by the place many times and never seen a thing. They were just stories. Will's place wasn't far from the ocean on the other side of the village where he lived. The only other starfish Andy had ever seen was on a neighbor's coffee table back home. These starfish were alive and brightly colored. The rugged coastal area around Point Charles was indeed beautiful. This day's weather was warm and the sea was calm. But on a stormy day, big waves would crash on the rocks where they were standing. Waves such as these were often pushed through cracks in the rocks with great force. Today's wave action was gentle. But when the seas were rough, these same waves would explode high in the air. Nearby was a grassy slope familiar to all the folks around Point Charles who were fond of whales, a favorite picnic spot, and a good place from which to watch them as they frolicked by, usually close into shore. Here, Andy got his first look at a whale, a sculpted whale.
I carved this some time ago out of a big redwood log. And it was placed here as a memorial to all the whales in the world. There's many types of whales. This one's a baby California gray whale. Her name's Gigi. And somewhere out there, there's a real Gigi.
Most of the earth and rock was solid, some wasn't. And it was difficult to know sometime which was solid and which might give way underfoot. According to Uncle Will, he'd spent the last few years telling folks who didn't know what was happening to whales and the danger they were in, hoping some way to awaken everyone to the brutality of whaling, how it jeopardized their very existence. Uncle Will first met Gigi a few years ago after she arrived at a marine research facility. He was amazed at her tremendous size. Less than a year old, she already weighed many tons. Some of those working on the whale study project were Will's friends. He visited often and quickly become attached to the orphaned youngster. Although only morsels were used in training, she had an incredible appetite, eating hundreds of pounds of seafood each day. With loving, tender care, she grew rapidly, many pounds a day. When full grown, she'd be 40 feet long and weigh as much as 10 automobiles. Like many other kinds of whales, she had no teeth. She would swallow her food without chewing and force the water out through her baleen or the brush-like straining system attached to her upper jaw. All whales breathe air as humans do, with a lung capacity enabling them to dive to great depths for as long as an hour. But it was the reported intelligence of the whale that intrigued Uncle Will. Their brain was many times the size of man's. Whales talked with each other for long distances underwater. Next to man, whales and dolphins are considered to be the most intelligent animals in the world. Will said he could talk to Gigi with the mind, and that Gigi would talk to him. Some scientists said it might be possible. Others said, absurd. Smart, yes, but not that smart. But Uncle Will was convinced he could talk to whales. And he was beginning to like his eccentric uncle more, and perhaps understand him more. It was obvious Uncle Will loved life and the things around him. After years of roaming, he'd found a home. And he seemed to know so much about the things around him. Andy had spent the night on the boat with Skip, sleeping in the bunks down below, after listening to records. Skip had another bike, and they were going riding. Although Andy enjoyed the canoe trip, he said he felt more at home on a bicycle. Skip agreed, saying you could go more places on a bike and get there faster. More than that, you couldn't do a wheelie in a canoe. On this ride, The boys headed inland to an old deserted sawmill that years ago used to supply lumber to the people in the area. The old sawmill was built around the turn of the century and had been in operation till about 15 years ago when logging in the area stopped. When it was running full steam back then, you could hear the whine of the saws for miles around. Nothing but ruins now.
Hey, look at the horse over there. Hey, yeah. Think he's wild? I don't know. Let's go try to feed him.
The horse from a nearby farm looked to be older than the boys. Neither of them hesitated in approaching the swayback. The boys finally got to the top of the hill, then a well-deserved rest before heading back. Both said they should have brought along something to eat, but they'd both be heading home soon, so it didn't matter. Enough of this, said Andy. Let's go now. That's when Skip suggested going down to the water to look around. Andy jumped and started up another rock. For a city kid, he could handle himself. Pleased with the move, he motioned for Skip to come on. Climbing those rocks wasn't the safest thing.
Andy, my leg, it hurts. I think it's broken.
Yeah. You okay? Stay here. I'll go get help.
Okay, but just hurry.
Andy's first and only thought was going for help. To make matters worse, the tide was moving in. Skip couldn't move. It was up to Andy. There was no phone around, so he ran for Frank's boat, using every muscle in his body to go as fast as he could.
Frank! Frank! Frank!
Frank, it's Skip. Broke his leg.
Frank was working on his boat when he saw and heard Andy. Not bothering with the ladder, he jumped to the deck and into the wheelhouse. Back on the rocks, Skip couldn't move.
Please hurry.
Frank got on the marine telephone. He called the Coast Guard in San Francisco.
Please hurry.
And then Uncle Will.
Please hurry. Connecting with Will Brand, Point Charles. Then get me the doctor. Please hurry. Please hurry.
Put the ready helicopter on the line. Boy injured on the rocks at Point Charles. Ready
The tide was moving higher. Skip had to be reached quickly.
Hey, Frank! Frank! You got everything?
son? All right, let's get this hooked up to the truck.
How you doing, Tiger? Where's it hurt? Hurt there? All right, the tide's coming. I have to get you out of here real quick, all right? It's gonna hurt. Just be for a minute. Hang on now. Gotta see if you can stand up just a little bit on your other leg. Come on.
I need the tape.
Throw the stuff. Throw the gear down.
There was no way that Frank could get his boy up a steep cliff without first splinting the injured leg so that the injury wouldn't be made worse. He worked deliberately, not rushing. There was no need to make a mistake now.
I'll splint it in a minute. We'll get you to the doctor and you'll be okay. Now, come on, hang in there.
It hurts.
The big Coast Guard rescue helicopter had finally arrived. Uncle Will motioned, no help needed. Will then gave the thumbs up OK signal, and the big rescue helicopter headed for home.
All right, Will, we're coming up. All right, Skip, this is gonna hurt. Can't help you. Can't get up on one leg, put you on my shoulder, and get you out of here real quick. Easy.
Come on, Frank. You're doing good.
Careful step after careful step had finally brought Frank and his boy safely to the top. The blanket served as a makeshift stretcher, and with it they could carry Skip to the truck. They just placed Skip in the truck when the doctor pulled up.
Arriving a few days ago, the purpose of his visit is to do a little political fence mending. Whales are again in the news as a foreign whaling fleet continues to make its way toward the coastal waters off California. The whalers are expected to spend a few weeks just outside the 200-mile limit and then move on towards Hawaii and mid-Pacific waters. Many residents along the California coast, where whales are often seen at certain times of the year, are greatly disturbed with continuing whaling operations and want to see them halted entirely. Meantime, whale watching has become a popular pastime.
Come on, boy. We've got some work to do. I don't know how, but I've got to find some way to find Gigi before the whale killers do. Come on!
Andy rushed out of the cabin not knowing where his uncle was headed. But one thing was certain, Will was in a hurry. His uncle was angry as could be at the whale hunters from faraway countries who came to hunt the whales off the coast. Will explained that almost all the countries in the world had stopped killing whales, except for a few. He felt if enough people became aware of the fact that so few whales were left, maybe something would happen that would stop all whale hunting. Beyond that, he wanted to go out personally and try to find the whale Gigi. She just had to be alive. What Uncle Will had in mind was to go to all the fishermen that he knew and ask them for help in keeping track of the whaling fleets. quite frequently during the whaling season, the fishermen would see the ships that killed the whales. Will believed that if he could somehow talk to the whalers and show them that killing whales was wrong, that maybe, well, just maybe, it might do some good. He said it was a 1 in a million chance, but better than doing nothing. Plus, if he knew where the whalers were working, he felt he might have a better chance of finding Gigi.
Will.
How's the boy doing?
Feeling much better this morning. Doctor says he'll walk again. It'll be a while, though, before he's off his crutches and out of his cast. And I've lost my whole crew. Come on, you look a little down. Let's get a cup of coffee.
Early that evening, to get his mind off thoughts that were troubling him, he went home and got some fishing tackle, thinking he'd teach Andy a little about the use of a rod and reel. As it happened, Will was out of practice, and the fish weren't biting anyway. They headed to the cabin empty-handed, except for the gear. Uncle Will got up the next morning still deeply troubled about Gigi. He wanted so much to find her. He wanted so much the whale killing to stop. He wanted to be alone with his thoughts. Andy and Skip were off somewhere, so Will decided to head for the beach. It was there that he often talked to the whales. Uncle Will was well known and liked around Point Charles, but he knew what folks were thinking and saying about him. They thought he was a little crazy, but he didn't care. Why was it, he wondered, why was it so difficult for people to open their minds to the possibility that man and whales could communicate? They were special creatures with remarkably developed brains. What could they teach us if we would only listen? Why should we sit idly by and let such unique creatures be destroyed? Why can't man live in harmony with nature instead of ruthlessly plundering? As Will walked the deserted beach, his mind drifted back to Gigi. When Gigi was brought to the research tank, it was done so with the plan she would be studied for a year and then returned to the ocean from where she came. The research scientists working with her planned to place a small radio transmitter on her back so that when she was released, her movements could be followed and more learned the ways and habits of whales. With the idea in mind that someday she might be found and approached by man at sea, much time was spent getting her accustomed to the touch and presence of human beings. Gigi seemed to enjoy the attention, and so did the dolphin that was most always with her. Then one day, in preparation for Gigi's return home, the scientists placed the radio on her back and prepared to soon bid her farewell. That night, Will and Andy relaxed.
Uncle Will?
Yeah?
Uncle Will, can you really talk to whales?
Of course. Not everybody believes I can, but I can.
How do you do it?
Andy, first you gotta have your heart full of love. Not just for the whales, but for every living creature. You see, the whale is smart and loving. Most people don't know that. Most people have never seen a whale. They're not in zoos or corrals or the forests. They live in the oceans of the world, where folks like us don't often go. But if we want to learn more about them, maybe even from them, man has got to stop killing them. And if the whale killers aren't stopped, soon there'll be no whales left in the ocean. If you learn to love whales, you'll hear them talk. And you may be able to talk to them too.
Okay, Uncle Will. I think I know what you mean. I'll see you in the morning.
Andy went on to bed as Uncle Will sat carving on a whale and listening to shortwave radio. Will often listened to his fishermen friends at night, talking about the day's events and luck with their nets and lines. What he was hearing tonight added even more to the hurt he'd felt for the past few days. For at sea, it had been a good day for the fishermen and the whalers.
Last week I had trouble with the bad antenna connection. Whales gotten tired. They had to surface to breathe. And that's when the whalers, they started picking them off one by one. You know, with those harpoons that explode after they hit? Before I left, I counted 8 harpooned whales. They were floating dead right on the surface. Yeah, it was pretty bad. It looked like they harpooned one of the young whales first, knowing its mother and the others would come back to it. It was a sorry sight to see.
Will and Andy kept the whale watch. So far, they hadn't seen anything but dolphin, an occasional shark, and floating seaweed. No sign of the whales, but Uncle Will assured Andy they'd see some soon. Later, with the sun once again dropping low in the sky, Will stood and wondered if Gigi was still alive, and would he see her again? Everyone took a lunch break. It's been the dream, I suppose, of many a young man to go to sea on a sailing ship. Sailing has a special feeling all its own. One of the chores aboard the boat fell to the skipper to handle, the matter of doing a little sail repair. Like most sailboats, there was an engine aboard if needed, but the best speed came from the sails. That is, providing there was enough wind. Uncle Will took over the helm to explain how the steering worked. The wheel was connected to a rudder that guided the vessel. To change course required keeping an eye on the compass and adjustment of the sails. Simple to explain, said Will, but not so simple to do. The reaction to Uncle Will and his idea he could talk to whales from other crew members was, well, they really didn't believe him, but didn't say so. If Uncle Will talked to the whales, what did he say to them? Will said he spoke to them with words of love and admiration, of hope that man might someday learn something from them that would help man learn more about himself. Whales don't talk like us or use tools Will reasoned because they had other ways of expressing their intelligence and intellectual ability. While Dr. Carson went about his scientific work and Frank took care of his navigational chores, Will and Andy kept the whale watch. Another sunset had come and gone. Darkness had set in.
Oh, hi, Andy. Hey, now that you've been to sea a number of days, how do you like it?
I like it pretty much now. It's fun. Now I got over my seasickness.
I know what you mean. You know, there's nothing worse than being seasick.
Yeah. Dr. Carson, I've been wanting to ask you something. My uncle says that he can talk to whales. Do you think he really can?
Well, Andy, it's true. You know, whales are as beautiful and as magnificent as your uncle says they are. And they are intelligent. Let me tell you something about whales.
The scientist explained to Andy that it was popular with some people, even scientists, to believe that the intelligence of the whale was such that someday interspecies communication might be possible. Personally, he didn't think so. But then, there were many things scientists weren't certain of or couldn't explain. One believed, he said, what he wanted to believe. The next day brought new hope of further whale sightings. There seemed to be a feeling among all the crew that they weren't too far away from whales, possibly even Gigi. Frank had gone forward to watch for whales on the surface, letting air out of their lungs. Geysers of vapor could only mean whales. Andy grabbed a pair of field glasses and was scanning the horizon. Frank decided he could get a better view of the horizon from the mainmast. Miss Debs, too, was now heading northwestward. No one had yet spotted a whale, but everyone felt that strange sensation they were there. Something you feel, but you don't know why. The waiting continued for a number of minutes. Suddenly, the electronic detection gear saw something.
We just picked up another pod of whales on sonar off the port side about 1,000 yards. Let's head over there.
That caused some long-awaited excitement as human eyes strained to see what the electronic eyes had already seen. The vessel was close upon some whales that had not yet surfaced for whatever reason. The boat continued moving forward in the general direction of the whales. They were there, all right. When would they surface? Will, still waiting, hadn't spotted anything yet. The same with the skipper. But, wait. There it was. The massive tail flukes. And another. Huge grays, diving and playing. Back in the cockpit, Dr. Carson had grabbed the headset and was listening to the sounds made by the California gray whale. He called everyone to listen. Unlike other types of whales, the humpback whale, for instance, who sang underwater songs loud and long, the grays didn't make much noise, but it was still exciting to hear.
Ah! Hey, thank you, Dr. Carson.
Did you hear that?
Hey.
No.
What's that?
I wonder where they are.
It was time again to dive. They had to move fast. Would one of those whales have markings? Dr. Carson's two divers quickly slipped into the wetsuits, like many times before. This time might be the payoff. Into the dinghy went the divers as Will and Andy gave assist. The divers would row out a ways from the boat, then dive and dive again, trying to get as close to each whale as possible. Will had told Andy many times that if he ever saw a pod of whales, he wanted to jump in with them. But wisely, he let the younger men do it as he watched. Outboard engines always disturbed whales, so the divers always paddled among them. Although maneuvering wasn't easy if the swells were rough. More watching and waiting as before. The dinghy was just about in position for the divers. In went one of the divers. The other manned the dinghy. The diver went down and came up again repeatedly. The whales were near, but not on the surface. Those on the boat felt the tension. Was Gigi with those whales? Up and then down again for the diver. Then up. And no signal. No Gigi. The 15-minute search was ended. It was back to the boat and wait for another day. The skipper of the Miss Debs II changed course later, heading into another area. Uncle Will sat alone with his thoughts, whatever they were. That night, Miss Debs II moved into a location thick with underwater kelp.
Tomorrow, Andy.
Tomorrow? Tomorrow what?
Tomorrow we'll find Gigi. Gigi knows we're out here looking for her.
About 9 o'clock that evening, Frank was working on his navigational charts and manning the radio gear. Will had come down to join him, and together they talked and listened to the shortwave broadcasts of fishermen a few hundred miles to the north. They heard them say that 11 more whales were killed that day. The following day, Miss Debs II sailed quietly over the kelp beds. Quiet until Uncle Will started screaming.
Over there! Over there! It's Gigi! It's Gigi! Head the boat over that way! It's Gigi! It's Gigi!
Without a moment's hesitation, the skipper swung the boat around, more out of shock than anything else. Will's yelling was heard by everyone who come running to the cockpit area. What was going on? No one knew. No one saw anything. But Will's action could mean only one thing.
There are whales nearby. I can hear them on the hydrophone.
Gigi! I know she's with them.
Frank headed up the mainmast for a better view as the divers prepared to head out again. From high up the mast, Frank was privileged to a fantastic sight. A pod of grays leisurely moving along on the surface. While the divers made final preparations to go out again, there were more anxious moments awaiting. Finally, the diver was under, in kelp so thick it was hard to see, much less maneuver. He saw 2 whales and headed in their direction.
Gigi. Gigi. I know you're there.
Down below, the diver was only a few feet from one of the grays as it shot to the surface. A powerful thrust of that magnificent fluke. And then a view of a gray whale that few divers have ever seen. Then the diver noticed something. What was that? The diver thought he saw what he was looking for. The marking that would positively identify Gigi. Yes, there were the markings. The markings they were looking for. It was Gigi. Will didn't know. Neither did Andy or anyone topside. Andy was nervous and fidgety, but tried to appear calm. He'd never waited like this before. A couple of curious dolphins swimming around watched the strange event. The minutes dragged by for Will and Andy and the rest. When would the diver surface? When would they know? A few seconds later, Gigi had been found. Their screaming and shouting probably could have been heard for miles around. Dr. Carson, too, was delighted with finding Gigi. But how in the world could it be explained? The finding of Gigi, was it just chance? Most folks would probably say it was. Even those who knew Will didn't really think he could talk to whales. And most scientific people would say it was luck. But maybe it wasn't luck. Well, so that's the story of Will Brannon and his search for Gigi. Young Andy spent another month or so with his uncle before he returned home and school. He left Point Charles with a newfound knowledge he'll never forget. Knowledge learned firsthand. He had shared an experience that likely comes only once in a lifetime, and certainly was more aware of life around him. Uncle Will, well, he's still seen around the docks on occasion, happy at having found Gigi. Not much has changed with him. He's still carving the whales he's so fond of. Frank and Skip, oh, they moved away from here not too long ago and bought another fishing boat and headed south. Now, what about Gigi? Well, she's out there in the ocean somewhere, doing what whales have been doing for millions of years. She's running free. And maybe by now, even has a youngster of her own. You know, if somehow it is possible for whales to know what man is thinking, and if whales can feel emotion, then perhaps she can be happy knowing that we wish her all the happiness her kind can feel. For she gave many people associated with her a lot of good feelings and a lot of knowledge.